The barbed wire fence stood 10 feet tall, silhouetted against the fading twilight of a German winter evening. Beyond it lay freedom, an elusive dream for thousands of American airmen trapped behind enemy lines. On this bitter cold night in March 1944, a group of men prepared to risk everything, crawling through a narrow tunnel dug beneath the watchful eyes of armed guards. The odds were stacked impossibly against them, but the alternative, remaining prisoners until the end of a war with no end in sight, was unthinkable. They would rather die trying to escape than live with the crushing certainty of captivity. This is the extraordinary story of how American prisoners of war engineered some of the most daring escapes of World War II, a testament to human ingenuity, courage, and an unbreakable desire for freedom. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. The story begins in the skies over occupied Europe. By 1943, the American air campaign against Nazi Germany had intensified to unprecedented levels. Waves of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators crossed the English Channel daily, penetrating deep into enemy territory to strike at the industrial heart of the Third Reich. The toll was devastating, not only for German war production, but for the American air crews themselves. Of the 125,000 American airmen who flew combat missions against Germany, more than 25,000 would be shot down. For these men, the war didn't end when their aircraft plummeted from the sky. It merely transformed into a different kind of battle, a battle for survival, for dignity, and ultimately for freedom. Lieutenant Charles Wehrle, a bombardier with the 508th Bomb Squadron, was flying his fifth mission when flak tore through his B-17's fuselage over Belgium. With two engines ablaze and the aircraft spiraling downward, the order came to bail out. Wehrle's parachute deployed successfully, but as he drifted toward the earth, he could see German soldiers already converging on his landing spot. Within minutes of touching down, he was captured, disarmed of his service pistol, and marched away at gunpoint. In that moment, he would later recall, I realized I had become that thing we had all dreaded, a prisoner of war. The journey into captivity followed a predictable pattern for downed airmen. Initial interrogation took place at transit centers like Dulag Luft near Frankfurt, where German intelligence officers employed psychological tactics to extract information. Solitary confinement, threats, false claims about comrades already revealing secrets. These were standard techniques. Most Americans gave only their name, rank, and service number as required by the Geneva Conventions. After interrogation, they were sorted based on rank, service branch, and various other factors, then transported to permanent camps scattered across the Reich. For officers like Wehrle, the destination was often Stalag Luft III, a sprawling compound near Sagan in what is now Poland. The camp had been purpose-built with escape prevention in mind. Barracks were elevated off the ground to prevent tunnel digging. Microphones were buried in the soil to detect underground activity. Most ingeniously, the Germans had chosen the location for its distinctive yellow sand, which would immediately be visible to guards if brought to the surface or used to fill clothing for disposal. The message was clear. Escape was impossible. But the Germans had underestimated their captives. From the moment of capture, the minds of many American prisoners turned to escape. This wasn't merely a question of personal freedom. It was a military duty. Every escapee forced the enemy to divert resources to recapture efforts, resources that might otherwise be used against Allied forces. Every guard watching a prison camp was one less soldier at the front lines. Every hour spent searching for escaped prisoners was an hour not spent producing weapons or ammunition. The POWs' military code of conduct was explicit. If I am captured, I will continue to resist by all means available. I will make every effort to escape. Life in the stalags followed a strange routine that mixed monotony with moments of intense anxiety. Roll call, or appell, as the Germans called it, happened twice daily, with prisoners standing at attention regardless of weather conditions while guards counted and recounted to ensure no one had disappeared during the night. Red Cross parcels provided critical supplements to the inadequate German rations, though these became increasingly scarce as the war progressed and German supply lines were disrupted by Allied bombing. Prisoners organized sports, theatrical productions, and educational classes, both to maintain morale and to create diversions for escape activities. Communication with the outside world was severely restricted, but not impossible. Heavily censored letters could be sent and received, typically limited to a few dozen words per month. More clandestinely, prisoners constructed hidden radio receivers from parts smuggled in Red Cross packages or stolen from German facilities. These crystal sets allowed them to hear BBC broadcasts and track the progress of the war. The news was often shared in whispers during exercise periods or written in tiny script on cigarette papers that could be quickly swallowed if guards approached. From these fragile threads of communication emerged a sophisticated intelligence network that connected various POW camps and remarkably maintained contact with Allied authorities in London. MI9, a specialized British intelligence unit, and the American MI6 program worked to support POW escape efforts, smuggling maps, compasses, and forged documents inside seemingly innocent items like Monopoly games, playing cards, and even within the bindings of books. These escape aids arrived concealed in Red Cross parcels that German censors had cleared. Organization was critical to successful escape planning. At Stalag Luft III and similar camps, prisoners established escape committees with military-style chain of command and specialized departments. The intelligence section gathered information about German routines, guard schedules, and local geography. Manufacturing produced civilian clothes, forged papers, and tools. Security maintained lookouts and developed warning systems for approaching guards. This level of organization ensured that escape attempts weren't random acts of desperation, but carefully orchestrated operations. First Lieutenant Albert "Al" Clark, an American fighter pilot shot down in 1942, became a key figure in the escape organization at Stalag Luft III. Initially skeptical that Americans should participate in escape attempts given their distance from friendly territory, Clark eventually became the camp's Big S, head of security operations. His team developed an elaborate system of lookouts known as stooges, who would warn of approaching guards using signals like adjusting a hat, turning a book page, or tying a shoelace. These seemingly innocuous gestures could silently transmit warnings across the entire compound within seconds. Technical innovation characterized the most ambitious escape attempts. At Stalag Luft III, 3 tunnels were simultaneously constructed given the names Tom, Dick, and Harry. The engineering challenges were immense. The tunnels had to descend 30 feet below the surface to avoid German microphones before extending horizontally toward the forest beyond the camp perimeter. They required support structures to prevent collapse, air supply systems to prevent suffocation, and lighting for the diggers. Every issue demanded an ingenious solution fashioned from whatever materials prisoners could acquire. The tunnel entrances themselves were masterworks of deception. Harry began beneath a stove in Barracks 104, accessed through a concrete block that could be removed and replaced without showing signs of tampering. The shaft descended through a system of wooden frames constructed from smuggled bedboards. Below, the tunnel stretched more than 300 feet, reinforced every few feet with supports made from bed parts and provisioned with a railway system made of wooden tracks. Carts fashioned from margarine tins and wooden slats moved excavated sand back to the entrance for disposal. Sand disposal presented one of the greatest challenges. The distinctive yellow soil would immediately give away any escape operation if detected on the surface. The prisoners' solution was as ingenious as it was daring. They created trouser bags with drawstrings at the bottoms, which could be filled with sand, and walked around the compound. By discreetly pulling the strings, they gradually released sand across the grounds, particularly in places where the soil was already disturbed, such as the volleyball court or vegetable garden areas. These men became known as penguins due to their distinctive waddling gait when carrying sand. American POWs brought particular skills to these escape operations. Technical expertise from civilian backgrounds, engineering, construction, electrical work, proved invaluable for tunnel design and implementation. Flight Lieutenant Leonard Trent, a former mining engineer before joining the Army Air Forces, designed ventilation systems using air pumps constructed from kit bags and tin cans salvaged from Red Cross parcels. Captain Julius Green, who had worked as an electrician in Chicago, rigged lighting systems using wires stolen from the camp's own electrical infrastructure. Document forgery reached astonishing levels of sophistication. Forgers meticulously copied German identity cards, travel permits, and work authorizations. Inks were created from melted colored pencils, boot polish, and even blood in some cases. Rubber stamps were carved from boot heels. The quality of these forgeries was so high that many could pass cursory inspection at checkpoints or railway stations. Over the course of the war, escape organizations produced thousands of such documents, not only for escape attempts, but also to help POWs who had successfully broken out to remain at large. The forgery operations extended to creating civilian clothing from military uniforms. Dyes made from coffee grounds, rust, and various food items transformed regulation blue into inconspicuous grays and browns. Tailors among the prisoners altered military jackets to resemble civilian work clothes by removing military insignia and adding fake civilian buttons and patches. Greatcoats were cut down into shorter civilian-style overcoats. The goal was to allow escapees to blend with the German civilian population during the crucial first hours of freedom. The psychological dimension of captivity and escape cannot be overstated. The Germans employed various tactics to break morale and discourage escape attempts. New arrivals were often told that the war was going poorly for the Allies, regardless of the actual situation, that escape was impossible, and that those caught attempting it would face harsh punishment. Propaganda broadcasts throughout the camps emphasized German military successes while downplaying Allied advances. Despite these efforts, American prisoners maintained remarkable resilience, often through humor and camaraderie that sustained them through the darkest periods of captivity. Not all escape methods involved the technical complexity of tunneling. Some of the most successful escapes employed simpler but equally audacious approaches. The wooden horse escape from Stalag Luft III in October 1943 involved prisoners constructing a vaulting horse for exercise that concealed a man digging beneath it. Each day the horse was carried to the same spot in the exercise yard. While prisoners performed gymnastics to distract the guards, a digger inside slowly extended a tunnel beyond the perimeter fence. After months of work, 3 men escaped through this tunnel and eventually made their way back to England. Wire jobs, cutting through the perimeter fence, required precise timing and often elaborate diversions. At Stalag Luft, Welsparst near Barth, prisoners staged a massive fight during an evening roll call. As guards rushed to break up the disturbance, 3 Americans slipped away to a predetermined section of fence where wire cutters had been hidden. In the confusion, they cut through 2 fences and disappeared into the gathering darkness. Though they were recaptured 3 days later, their escape forced the Germans to assign additional guards to perimeter security, drawing personnel from other duties. The Great Escape from Stalag Luft III on the night of March 24, 1944, stands as the most famous breakout of the war. 76 Allied airmen crawled through the tunnel Harry and emerged just short of the forest line. Though most Americans who had worked on the tunnel had been transferred to another compound shortly before the escape, their contributions to its construction and organization were significant. The aftermath was tragic. Hitler, enraged by the escape, ordered the execution of 50 recaptured prisoners, a war crime that would feature prominently in post-war trials. Less well-known, but equally remarkable, was the story of Lieutenant Colonel Jerry Sage, an American OSS officer captured in North Africa. Sage made 7 escape attempts from various camps, earning the nickname the Cooler King for the time he spent in solitary confinement as punishment. His most ingenious attempt involved creating a diversion by setting fire to the camp theater during a performance, allowing 17 prisoners to slip away in the confusion. Though Sage himself was recaptured after 5 days on the run, his persistent escape attempts tied up significant German resources throughout his captivity. The fates of successful escapees varied dramatically. Some, like Lieutenant William Ashe, managed to contact local resistance networks that provided shelter, food, and guidance toward neutral territories or Allied lines. These escape lines, often run by ordinary civilians risking execution to help Allied personnel, shepherded hundreds of evaders and escapees to safety throughout the war. In occupied France, the Comet Line helped downed airmen and escaped prisoners cross the Pyrenees into neutral Spain. In Denmark, fishermen risked their lives to transport escapees across the Baltic to neutral Sweden. Not all locals were willing to help, however. The German occupation authorities imposed severe penalties on civilians caught assisting escaped prisoners, including death in many cases. They also offered rewards for information leading to recapture. In rural areas where strangers were immediately conspicuous, escapees faced particular challenges. Many were betrayed by civilians fearful of reprisals or motivated by rewards. Language barriers posed additional problems. Few Americans spoke fluent German, making them immediately suspicious when interacting with the local population. In January 1945, as Soviet forces advanced from the east, the Germans made a fateful decision to evacuate POW camps in their path rather than allow liberation. This began a series of forced marches in which thousands of American prisoners were compelled to walk hundreds of miles westward in the depths of winter. With temperatures falling to -20 degrees Fahrenheit, prisoners trudged through deep snow with inadequate clothing, minimal food, and little shelter. Many suffered frostbite, pneumonia, and exhaustion. Some collapsed by the roadsides, too weak to continue. These marches, however, created unexpected opportunities for escape. The chaos of moving large groups of prisoners through the German countryside, often at night and during air raids, allowed small groups to slip away unnoticed. Captain Robert Anstedt and 5 fellow Americans disappeared during a nighttime rest period near Dresden, hiding in a bombed-out factory until their column moved on. They survived by scavenging food from abandoned farms and eventually encountered American forces near Leipzig in April. Others were less fortunate, being recaptured and, in some cases, summarily shot by SS units operating behind the front lines. One of the most remarkable mass escapes occurred during the evacuation of Oflag 64, a camp for American officers in Poland. As more than 400 prisoners began a forced march westward in January 1945, over 250 men slipped away in small groups. Some hid in barns and haystacks, while others feigned illness and were left behind in the camp infirmary. These escapees faced a complex situation. They needed to avoid not only German patrols, but also Soviet forces, who often encountered Western personnel with suspicion or hostility, sometimes even sending them to Soviet camps rather than repatriating them to Allied control. The experience of American POWs differed significantly from that of their Soviet counterparts in German hands. While Americans generally received treatment in accordance with the Geneva Conventions, though with many hardships and violations, Soviet prisoners faced deliberate starvation, forced labor in lethal conditions, and outright execution. Of the 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured by the Germans, an estimated 3.3 million died in captivity. By contrast, about 1% of American POWs died while held by the Germans. This stark difference reflected the racial ideology of the Nazi regime and its view of the war on the Eastern Front as an existential struggle against Bolshevism. Even within American POW experiences, there were significant variations. Jewish American prisoners often faced particular dangers if their religious identity was discovered. Some were sent to harsher labor camps or even concentration camps, despite their status as military prisoners. African American airmen, though relatively few in number due to the segregated military of the time, reported mixed experiences. Some faced discrimination from German guards influenced by Nazi racial ideology, while others noted they were treated no differently than white prisoners. These varied experiences reflected the complex intersection of military law, Nazi ideology, and individual attitudes among German camp personnel. American POWs developed sophisticated codes for communicating intelligence back to the United States. Letters home would contain seemingly innocent references to family members or local events that actually conveyed information about camp conditions, German troop movements visible from the camp, or details of military installations prisoners had observed during transport. MISX, the American Military Intelligence Unit responsible for POW affairs, trained sensors to recognize these coded messages and extract valuable intelligence from apparently routine correspondence. The capture of high-value prisoners sometimes led to special treatment and unique escape opportunities. When Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, General George Patton's son-in-law, was captured in North Africa, the Germans initially placed him in Oflag 64, but monitored him closely due to his family connection. In April 1945, Patton himself authorized a bold rescue mission, led by Task Force Bomb, to liberate Waters and other prisoners. Though the mission ultimately failed, with most of the American tanks destroyed and the rescuers themselves taken prisoner, it demonstrated the lengths to which the Allied command would go to recover particular POWs. Prisoners developed remarkable innovations for survival and escape. At Stalag Luft III, they created a clandestine distillery using potato peelings, fruit from Red Cross parcels, and copper tubing fashioned from electrical wire. The resulting alcohol served multiple purposes, as an antiseptic for medical treatments, as barter material with guards, and as a coping mechanism for the psychological strain of captivity. More practically, it proved useful for bribing guards to provide information or materials that could aid escape efforts. Communication between compounds within the same camp often required ingenious methods. At Stalag Luft III, where Americans were housed in separate areas from British and Canadian prisoners, messages were exchanged using a system known as the mail drop. During sports events where prisoners from different compounds might briefly interact, tiny messages written on cigarette papers would be concealed in hollowed-out ping-pong balls or tennis balls that could be casually tossed over internal fences during apparent play. These communications coordinated escape plans, shared intelligence, and maintained the morale network that sustained resistance efforts. Religious services provided both spiritual comfort and opportunities for clandestine activities. Chaplains held regular services in the camps, often with a reluctant permission of German authorities bound by the Geneva Conventions to allow religious observance. These gatherings became covers for passing information, as men who wouldn't normally interact could exchange whispered updates while appearing to participate in prayers or hymns. Some chaplains became active participants in escape organizations, using their special status to move between compounds and carry messages. Health issues posed significant challenges for prisoners contemplating escape. Malnutrition was common, with the standard German ration providing barely 1,500 calories daily, inadequate for maintaining weight, let alone supporting the physical demands of escape and evasion. Red Cross parcels, when they arrived, added vital calories and nutrients. Camp medical officers, themselves prisoners, worked to identify and treat those suffering from deficiency diseases like beriberi and pellagra. They also maintained secret reserves of medications smuggled from Red Cross supplies for use by potential escapees. The German guards, or goons as the prisoners called them, were themselves a diverse group. Many were Luftwaffe personnel deemed unsuitable for combat duty due to age or injuries. Some were professional military men who generally adhered to the conventions of war and treated prisoners correctly, if not warmly. Others, particularly those affiliated with the Nazi Party, were more ideologically driven and harsh in their treatment. Prisoners quickly learned to distinguish between these types and tailored their interactions accordingly. The ferrets, German personnel specifically tasked with detecting escape activities, were particularly feared for their skill and persistence. A psychological chess match developed between captors and captives. Prisoners deliberately created patterns of behavior to lull guards into complacency. Activities like the daily exercise routine with the wooden horse were maintained with rigid consistency for weeks before any actual tunneling began, ensuring that guards would see them as normal and unremarkable. Similarly, the Germans employed psychological tactics, such as randomly transferring prisoners between camps to disrupt escape organizations and spreading false rumors about Allied defeats to damage morale. Not all resistance took the form of physical escape attempts. Prisoners engaged in numerous acts of sabotage and disinformation. Those assigned to work parties in factories or farms deliberately slowed production, damaged equipment, and produced defective items. Within the camps, they created elaborate hoaxes to waste German resources, such as planting false evidence of tunnels to trigger time-consuming searches. Some even conducted sophisticated disinformation campaigns, feeding false intelligence to guards known to report prisoner conversations to their superiors. The Germans' systematic approach to preventing escapes evolved throughout the war. Early in the conflict, security measures were relatively basic. As escape attempts grew more sophisticated, countermeasures expanded accordingly. By 1944, in addition to the elevated barracks and buried microphones, camps featured multiple fences, tripwires, alarm systems, and dedicated search teams with trained dogs. Guard towers were positioned to ensure overlapping fields of fire, with powerful searchlights that could illuminate any section of the perimeter. Some compounds even installed seismographic devices to detect tunneling vibrations. The cat-and-mouse game between prisoners and guards produced innovations on both sides. When the Germans began using microphones to detect tunneling sounds, prisoners developed techniques for digging silently, using cloth-wrapped tools and working only during periods of authorized noise, such as singing or exercise. When guards began searching for disturbed earth indicating tunnel entrances, prisoners created seamless trapdoors, concealed beneath immovable objects like stoves or concrete footings. Each German security measure provoked a corresponding adaptation by the escape committees. Weather conditions significantly impacted escape planning. Winter attempts faced the challenges of frozen ground that made tunneling nearly impossible, and snow that would show footprints of escapees. However, longer nights provided more darkness for movement, and heavy clothing to protect against cold would not appear suspicious. Summer escapes offered better traveling conditions but shorter nights and greater visibility. Most major escape attempts were timed for spring or fall, balancing these factors while avoiding the extremes of German winter or the heightened agricultural activity of summer that would put more civilians in the countryside. The role of American intelligence in supporting POW escapes increased as the war progressed. Initially, the United States lacked the specialized expertise that Britain had developed through MI9. By 1943, however, MI6 had established sophisticated methods for communicating with prison camps and providing escape aids. They developed playing cards that concealed sections of maps when soaked in water, phonograph records with razor-thin silk maps sandwiched between the vinyl layers, and Monopoly sets containing real German currency hidden beneath the game board. These items passed German inspection while providing crucial assistance to potential escapees. For those who succeeded in escaping, the journey had only begun. Evading recapture required careful movement, typically at night, with hiding during daylight hours. Food was a constant concern, as escapees couldn't risk entering shops with their limited German and forged ration cards. Many survived on raw vegetables from fields, fruit from orchards, and occasional assistance from sympathetic civilians. Water was collected from streams and rain, though this carried the risk of illness. The physical demands of this existence, especially for men already weakened by captivity, were extreme. The psychological burden of escape was equally challenging. Constant vigilance against detection, the knowledge that recapture could mean execution, especially after the Great Escape reprisals, and the uncertainty of the journey's outcome created immense stress. Some escapees reported hallucinations and paranoia after days of insufficient sleep and inadequate nutrition. Those who succeeded often attributed their survival not only to planning and skill, but also to luck and the compassion of civilians who risked their own lives to provide assistance. By 1945, as Allied armies pushed into Germany from both east and west, the nature of escapes changed. Rather than attempting to reach neutral countries or friendly lines hundreds of miles away, many prisoners chose to hide in the German countryside and await liberation. Lieutenant James Keefe, who escaped from Stalag Luftwaffe in April 1945, concealed himself in a barn just 5 miles from the camp. For 8 days, he remained hidden in the hayloft, occasionally receiving food from the elderly German farmer who, recognizing that the war was nearly over, was willing to take the risk of helping an American. On April 28th, Keefe encountered an advancing American armored column and became one of the war's last successful escapees. The final days at many camps were chaotic as German authority collapsed under the approach of Allied forces. At Stalag Luftwaffe near the Baltic coast, the German commandant approached the senior American officer, Colonel Hubert Zemke, with an unprecedented proposal. Rather than evacuate the camp's 9,000 prisoners and risk casualties during Allied bombing, he would surrender the camp intact if the Americans could maintain order until Soviet forces arrived. Zemke agreed, and on April 30, 1945, the prisoners awoke to find the German guards gone and their own officers in control. The next day, Soviet tanks arrived to find an American flag, crafted from scraps of colored cloth, flying over the liberated camp. Not all camps ended so peacefully. At some locations, SS units attempted to force prisoners on death marches or even threatened mass executions as Allied forces approached. At Stalag 90B, American prisoners barricaded themselves in their compounds and refused to comply with evacuation orders, correctly suspecting that the Germans intended to use them as hostages or human shields. Armed with improvised weapons and facing SS guards with machine guns, they prepared for a final confrontation. Fortunately, advancing American forces reached the camp before the situation exploded into violence. The liberation of the camps brought a complex mix of emotions for the former prisoners. Joy at regained freedom mingled with physical exhaustion, and in many cases, a profound psychological disorientation. Men who had spent years adapting to the rigid routines and constant vigilance of captivity suddenly found themselves free but often struggling to process their experiences. Medical teams accompanying the liberating forces were shocked by the physical condition of many prisoners. Severe malnutrition, untreated illnesses, and psychological trauma were common, requiring months of rehabilitation. After liberation, most American ex-POWs were transported to Camp Lucky Strike in France, one of several processing centers established for recovered Allied personnel. Here they received medical treatment, new uniforms, back pay, and debriefing by intelligence officers interested in their observations of German military movements and installations. Many were surprised to find themselves treated with a mixture of respect and suspicion, respect for having endured captivity, but suspicion about whether they might have been compromised or recruited as German agents during their imprisonment. The journey home continued by ship across the Atlantic, with many former POWs surprised at the changes they found in the United States. The America they returned to had been transformed by war production, women in the workforce, and new social attitudes. Many struggled to reconnect with families and communities that could not comprehend their experiences. The military provided little in the way of psychological support or transition assistance, operating on the assumption that men should simply be grateful to have survived and ready to resume civilian lives. For most former POWs, the psychological impacts of captivity emerged gradually. Many experienced what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, nightmares, anxiety, depression, and difficulties with personal relationships. Some developed lifelong habits shaped by their imprisonment, like hoarding food or sleeping fully clothed in case of sudden emergencies. Others reported a heightened appreciation for freedom and simple pleasures, as well as deep bonds with fellow ex-prisoners that lasted throughout their lives. The historical legacy of these escapes extends beyond individual stories of courage. The technical innovations developed by POWs, from tunnel engineering to document forgery, influenced military evasion training for generations. The psychological insights gained about resistance to interrogation and maintaining morale in captivity shaped the development of the Military Code of Conduct in 1955. Most importantly, these escapes demonstrated that even in the most controlled environments, human creativity, determination, and the desire for freedom could not be extinguished. In the decades following the war, many former POWs shared their stories through memoirs, interviews, and historical documentations projects. These first-hand accounts preserve the details of escape methods, daily challenges of camp life, and complex relationships between prisoners and captors. They formed an invaluable historical record of a unique aspect of the war experience, neither combat nor home front, but a shadowy realm where Americans continued to fight using wit and will rather than weapons. Organizations like the American Ex-Prisoners of War and the Stalag Luft III Association formed to maintain connections between former captives and preserve their shared history. Annual reunions allowed these veterans to reconnect with the men who had shared their captivity, while educational programs brought their experiences to younger generations. As their numbers dwindled with the passage of time, these organizations took on the additional role of ensuring that the sacrifices and resistance of American POWs would not be forgotten. Today, at sites like the former Stalag Luft III, now in Poland, visitors can see remnants of these escape attempts. Reconstructed tunnel entrances, replicas of escape equipment, and photographs of the men who dared to challenge their captivity serve as tangible reminders of their courage. Memorial plaques honor both those who succeeded in their quests for freedom and those who paid the ultimate price for attempting it. These physical sites of memory complement the written and oral histories that keep these stories alive. The experiences of American POWs in German camps during World War II occupy a unique place in military history. Unlike the brutal captivity endured by prisoners in the Pacific Theater or on the Eastern Front, their story is not primarily one of atrocity and survival against deliberate annihilation. Instead, it is a narrative of resistance against confinement, of maintaining military discipline and purpose under adverse conditions, and of continuing to fight the enemy through means other than conventional combat. In their refusal to accept captivity as the end of their contribution to the war effort, these men demonstrated extraordinary resourcefulness and courage. Their legacy lives on in unexpected ways. The techniques developed for communicating covertly, creating forged documents, and constructing hidden spaces influenced not only military evasion training, but also the tradecraft of intelligence agencies during the Cold War. The psychological insights gained about maintaining morale and resisting enemy pressure informed approaches to potential nuclear conflict scenarios, where military personnel might face similar challenges of isolation and coercion. Even in popular culture, films like The Great Escape cemented the image of the ingenious, determined POW as an enduring symbol of resistance against tyranny. Perhaps most importantly, the story of American POWs and their escape attempts reminds us that freedom is not merely a political concept, but a fundamental human need. In the most restrictive circumstances imaginable, surrounded by armed guards and barbed wire, thousands of miles from home, these men refused to surrender their autonomy and agency. They demonstrated that the human spirit cannot be confined by fences or watchtowers when the desire for liberty burns strongly enough. In doing so, they embodied the very values for which the war against fascism was being fought. As the last veterans of World War II leave us, their experiences pass from living memory into history. The tunnels they dug have largely collapsed back into the earth. The forged documents have yellowed in archives. The camps themselves have been repurposed or reclaimed by forests and fields. But the determination they showed in refusing to accept captivity as their fate remains as relevant today as it was 8 decades ago. In a world where freedom is still threatened and human dignity still challenged, their story continues to inspire and instruct. The escape attempts of American POWs in German camps during World War II represent a chapter of military history that transcends national boundaries and speaks to universal human values: courage, ingenuity, loyalty, and an unquenchable desire for freedom. From the sandy soil beneath Stalag Luft III to the frigid Baltic coast near Stalag Luft I, from the forest marches across Poland to the final liberations in the spring of 1945, these men demonstrated the resilience of the human spirit in the face of oppression. Their stories remind us that even in the darkest circumstances, resistance is possible, hope endures, and the will to be free remains one of humanity's most powerful forces.